Hey everyone, welcome to a new video. I'm in Bath, Michigan, and if that town name sounds familiar, you guys may have heard about this story. It's a pretty infamous story around this part of Michigan. 44 people died at the schoolhouse up here. Now we're gonna get into the whole story. I'm gonna walk up the road. Now the original schoolhouse has been torn down, but there's a nice memorial where it once stood. So we're gonna get into the story and then we're gonna walk up the street and show you guys this memorial. It's a very crazy but sad case. Now the actual massacre happened on May 18th, 1927. The perpetrator, his name was Andrew Cahoe. He was 55 years old. Now we're going to get into more of his background in a little bit, but first we're going to talk about the actual events of the massacre and what happened. So on the morning of May 18th, about 8:45 or so in the morning, Andrew detonated several fire bombs in his house and also in several of the buildings on his property, causing lots of debris, shrapnel, and of course, big fires to spread. Several of the neighbors noticed the fire and of course rushed over to see what was going on. One of the men, his name was O.H. Bush, crawled through the debris and broken windows to see if he could find anyone, any survivors. He quickly found out that there was no one inside, but he did notice that there was a bunch of dynamite kind of hidden in the corner. So he ended up picking up the dynamite and walking back outside. He noticed a man leaving in his truck, and that man happened to be Andrew Cahoe. Now, Andrew told O.H. Bush and several of the people that stopped by, he told them that he was going to head off to the school, and then he drove off. Now, classes at the Bath Consolidated School began at 8:30 a.m., and Andrew had set an alarm clock in the basement that was strapped to multiple dynamite. Now, when the explosion went off, it caused ultimate destruction. 38 people were killed in the initial explosion, most of those being children. There was even some eyewitnesses and survivors who were interviewed afterwards who stated that, quote, "The air seemed to be full of children and flying desks and books. Children were tossed high in the air. Some were catapulted out of the building." Another eyewitness named Robert Gates said that the scene was, quote, "pure chaos." He continues by saying, "Mother after mother came running into the schoolyard and demanded information about their child." Another person states that she saw one mother sitting on the bank a short distance from the school with a little dead girl on each side of her. Now, the north wing of the school had collapsed, leaving the edge of the roof on the ground. Now, at this point, Andrew drove up in his truck roughly about 30 minutes or so after the explosion happened. When he showed up, he saw Superintendent Emery Howick summoned him over to his truck. Apparently, Andrew and Emery were fighting over some sort of long gun, and that is when Andrew ended up detonating more explosives that he had in his truck, immediately killing himself, Emery, the superintendent, Nelson McFerrin, who was a retired farmer, and also Cleo Clayton, who was an 8-year-old second grader. Now, I guess what's even more tragic is Cleo, the 8-year-old, had actually survived the first blast of inside the school. He then wandered out of the school building only to be killed by Andrew's exploding truck. Now, the truck explosion spread debris and shrapnel over a large distance, causing damage to cars even as far as a half block away. Of course, there was multiple fires and tons of people injured. In total, there was 44 people who lost their lives that day. 38 kids died, as well as 6 adults. Now, before the actual events at the school, Andrew ended up murdering his wife, whose name was Nellie. During the search for additional survivors and victims, many of the rescuers found an additional 500 pounds of dynamite, which actually had failed to detonate, meaning that Andrew's ultimate goal was to kill everyone inside that school. Now, investigators speculated that the initial explosion may have caused a short circuit in the second set of bombs, which prevented those from detonating. And so that is their theory on why the other set of dynamite did not explode. Police, of course, finally made it to Andrew's farmhouse, where they, of course, sifted through the wreckage, hoping to find Nellie, Andrew's wife. Unfortunately, they could not find her, and so they believed at first that she was at some sort of sanitarium. However, her charred remains were found among the ruins of the farm. One of the items that police found was on Andrew's fence. There was a wooden sign that Andrew had attached to the fence, and it said, "Criminals are made, not born." Now, you're probably wondering, what on earth, why did Andrew do all this? Like, what caused him to want to go on this terrible massacre? Now, Andrew was born on February 1st, 1872, into a family of 13 children. After graduating, he studied electrical engineering at Michigan State College and ended up moving to St. Louis, Missouri, where he worked as an electrician for several years. However, at some point during this time frame, he ended up suffering a head injury after he fell. He ended up returning back to Michigan and living at his father's farm. Now, Andrew married Nellie, or her real name was Ellen, in 1912 at the age of 40. And 7 years later, they moved to a farm outside Bath Township. Now, Andrew was said to be dependable, helpful, and even did some volunteer work for his neighbors. However, he was also described as being notoriously impatient with any kind of disagreement. And apparently he had shot and killed a neighbor's dog that had come on the property. And also he had beaten one of his horses to death when it did not perform to his expectations. So obviously there was some early precursors to him being violent before this massacre took place. Now, in 1922, the Bath Township school tax was $12 for every $1,000 worth of property, with the valuation of Andrew's farm being $10,000 back then. Now, in 1923, the school board raised the tax to $18 per $1,000 valuation, and in 1926, the taxes went up to $19.80. This meant that Andrew's tax liability went from $122 to $198. And in June of 1926, Andrew was notified that the widow of his wife's uncle, who actually was in charge of the mortgage on their property, had begun the foreclosure proceedings, meaning that Andrew and his family would potentially lose everything. Now, the local sheriff who served the foreclosure notice on Andrew's property, he remembered hearing Andrew tell him, quote, "If it hadn't been for the $300 school tax, I might have paid off this mortgage." And he was also remembered quoted as saying, If I can't live in that house, no one else will. Now, Andrew was also appointed in 1925 as the temporary town clerk, but he was defeated in the April 5th, 1926 election for that position. This public rejection angered him, and most people speculate that this defeat is kind of what put Andrew over the edge and what caused him to want to go on this murderous revenge against the Bath Schoolhouse and the community. By the time of the actual massacre, his wife had actually become chronically ill with what resembled tuberculosis, for which, again, there wasn't really any treatment or cure at that time. And her frequent hospital stays may also have contributed to the family's debt. His wife was discharged from Lansing's St. Lawrence Hospital on May 16th and was murdered by Andrew sometime between her release from the hospital and the massacre, which happened 2 days later. But again, rest in peace to all 44 victims. Just an incredibly tragic situation. And again, who knows if there could have been anything done to help stop this from happening. Obviously, a lot of us go through traumatic experiences, losing homes, losing elections or whatever, and a lot of us don't go on murderous rampages because of it. So obviously there must have been something else maybe mentally wrong with Andrew that kind of helped propel him to do what he did. This area where we are right now, this is where the schoolhouse once stood. Again, it was pretty much obliterated by the bombs. They do have this nice memorial kind of plaques here talking about what happened. Thank you to everyone who commented asking for me to do this case. Thank you for those who participated in the poll that I did. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys on the next video. See you soon.